Alrighty. What is up, everybody? Welcome to our weekly deep dive podcast. If this is your first time tuning in, this podcast is one where we usually what we use this time for is an opportunity to do exactly what the name says, take a deeper dive into the subjects that we've been dealing with in our Sunday services here at Wayfarers Christian Church. But here recently, we've been doing something that's been really awesome, I would say. I've really enjoyed it, where we have been doing deep dives on people's stories, especially many of the members and people that are connected with us here at Wayfarers. And today, I'm extra excited because we are doing the deep dive on Jordan's story. But before we do that, I want to introduce everybody that's here with me. Again, I'm Nick Griffin. I'm the lead pastor here. I'm joined by Ashley Wakefield.
Hello.
Jacob Dooley.
Hey.
Back in the back, we've got our teaching pastor, Noah Randolph, on producer role and / the voice of God. He's kind of just off screen. And our guest for today, my good friend, Jordan Miller. You want to say hey to everybody, Jordan?
Hello, everybody, Jordan.
So, Jordan is a great friend of mine, one of my oldest friends.
Easy with the old.
We went to college together. We met actually before college at a church camp that we both attended when we were teenagers. But then we both ended up at Mid-South Christian College, going through college together. He moved away, as he talked about a little bit in his story that you could hear before we got started here today. And recently has been kind of working on ways to get moved back to Memphis so that he could be a part of our church here at Wayfarers. He's really enjoyed what we're doing, and we've really enjoyed having the chances to hang out with Jordan when he has come. It's been twice now, right? You've been able to actually come in person?
Say, are we really enjoying the screaming 2-year-olds, though?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, we are.
And so we want to make sure to give a shout out to Jordan's wife, Jamie, who I know watches these, and his two daughters, Rachel and Kayla.
You got it.
So,
Good job.
Shout out to the whole family there. We love the screaming 2-year-olds. It's makes my screaming 1.5-year-old less distracting there at church. So,
and see, we like the screaming 1.5-year-old because our 2-year-olds may be the loudest, but at least they're not the only ones.
And so we've been able to have Jordan with us a couple times when he's been able to make the trip. But we figured this would be a great opportunity for people to get to know him a little bit better and get to know his story as well. I did want to say before we jump into Jordan's story, you probably caught a little bit of it as he was telling the broad strokes overview of his story, but we were saying this one's probably not going to be your family-friendly G-rated story so if you're happening to be listening with your little kids, maybe listen to this one first and decide for yourself if this is something you want to listen with them. But I think it's a powerful story, and I'm very thankful that Jordan wanted to come and share this story with us today. So I'm going to leave it really wide open, Jordan. How do you want to start? Where do you want to start telling us about yourself?
I guess we'll start with just kind of some of the groundwork. So,
Right.
Because I had to squish it into a minute. So,
Yeah.
Like I said, I grew up in church. My dad was involved in ministry my entire life. From about age 5, he actually worked in ministry. So he was always involved in church when I was really little. But then at age 5, he became a youth pastor. And from then on, his job was always ministry. So I was always a bit of a different kid. Didn't really fit in very well. And I also have a really good imagination, so that kind of led to a lot of alone time, and I kind of developed these kind of escapist tendencies where I like to escape into fantasy, which kind of became a double-edged sword later on. I can remember as far back as 6 years old, some kid who was like a year or two older than me asking me, "Are you gay?" I was probably 5.
Yeah.
So I didn't know what that meant.
Right.
So then we moved, and when I was about 7, we moved to Indiana. The camp that a lot of you guys have gone and helped at over the past year or two. My dad was the executive director of that camp for about 4 years, give or take.
Okay. Which is, it was a Christian summer
Yeah.
camp and missions, like training camp,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it trained teenagers to go on short-term mission trips.
Yeah.
At the time, so
So your dad was director there. You were like 7, you said?
about 7. I think I turned 7 the year we moved.
Okay.
So I remember we had my birthday in Florida, and then like a week or two later, we moved to Indiana.
Yeah.
It was
That's
cold.
quite a move.
In January. It was cold.
That is quite a move.
That
So-
is a shock.
We had been private schooled up to that point, Christian private schools. There were no Christian private schools nearby in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. So my dad and my mom decided to homeschool us all. So thankfully, we still had a couple of families that lived nearby, so I wasn't like the completely isolated homeschooler.
Right.
But I was still the awkward homeschooler, so I spent a lot of time by myself.
And so that was the camp in Indiana.
That was the camp in Indiana.
You were about 7. Is
About
that
7.
I remember when we've talked about this story before, was you talked about kind of your escape into fantasy and stuff like that. That for a lot of times was like literature and fantasy books and stuff like that too, right? Like you were
That came later.
okay.
Because at that point, I'm 7 years old. My reading skills are still kind of weak.
Sure.
So I loved any fantasy like movies I could get my hands on, but it was the 90s and my parents were good conservative Christians. So
Yeah.
my pickings were slim. I loved The Little Mermaid because mermaids are magical and hello, magic. I loved Fantasia because, well, they had magical creatures in it. And I snatched up any fantasy I could get my hands on, but it wasn't until more like Texas where I actually got a chance to start like reading fantasy and such. So a lot of my fantasy in Indiana was taking like these fairy tales and movies that I was seeing from Disney and taking these kind of fantasy ideas and just then when I'm off by myself playing, just kind of creating my own imaginary world and all imaginary characters.
Yep.
We lived in the country, so we had sticks. I had a different stick, which was a different prop for each character. Piles of them that my dad was always making me throw away because they were problems when they tried to mow the grass.
But you're like, no, these are my
I would find trees.
props.
I would find trees to hide them under, and then they would decide to mow under that tree. So,
And so you felt like you were a loner. You were just kind of in your own imaginary world.
I didn't want to be a loner.
Yeah.
But I was. And so in my imaginary world, there were always crowds of characters, and I always had lots of friends.
Yeah.
They just weren't real.
And
they were always, these powerful magical creatures so that they could beat up anyone that I didn't like.
yeah. And so you feel like you're sort of unknowingly, it was helpful to you because it was this imaginary world you could escape to, but it was also creating some of the cycles and habits that later on would become.
Yeah, I created that. Okay, well, I'm not happy about what's going on in my life, so now I'm going to run off to Fantasyland.
Yeah.
Right.
So once I discovered sexuality, it was a hop, skip, and a jump from Fantasyland of magic and fairy wands to sexual fantasies.
And so you mentioned that in the short version of your story that that was, after discovering your sexuality, that was kind of the next addiction, that became. Do you remember how old you were when that part of your life started?
I do.
Yeah.
That was a complicated story that I couldn't sum up in
the 1 minute.
minute.
Well, you got
So,
time. We're doing the deep dive, so.
Yeah.
So when I was 12 years old, I'm almost certain on that age, but I aged myself based on where I lived. So I remember I lived in Texas, and it was towards the end of our time in Texas. So I was almost certainly 12 years old, maybe. But when I was 12 years old, there was a guy that I was good friends with, and we were really close, and we wound up just experimenting with each other. It never really got into anything hardcore. It was very innocent experimenting the first time. But I remember very clearly after that first time going, I think that was a sexual sin. Now, kind of back up a little. Sex was like a taboo word in my brain. Like, I remember one time I was preaching for Father's Day because all the kids took over the service. So I took over for my dad and I preached. I remember I was reading a passage in 1 Corinthians and came across the word about sexual sin, and I skipped it because
You're like, I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
I not only did I not know what it meant, I like knew that I was like, ooh, we don't talk about that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So I didn't know what sexual sin was, but somehow in that moment, my brain made the connection. Like, okay, this is wrong. I wish I could say in that moment it ended,
Yeah.
but it didn't. It continued for a little while. It didn't continue very long. The other guy actually was the one who got a conscience and was like, dude, we got to stop.
And you, also to back up a little bit to give people context, you know, you've talked at this point about you were in Florida and then you were in Indiana and then you were in
Yeah,
Texas.
so I
what was all
lived,
the moving about?
my dad moved with jobs, basically. When we were in South Carolina, he was a driver and distributed Belgian waffle mix. That job moved him to Florida, where he became a youth minister. While doing youth ministry, he took kids on a mission trip with the ministry in Indiana, which is how we wound up with him being the director. When they did the trip there, their executive director was dying of cancer. And I'm not sure how, of all the people they interacted with, they picked my dad to be the one to replace him when he died, but they did.
Came about.
And so we were there almost 4 years. That was the longest we lived in one place up until we moved to Mississippi. So then we were there till about 2000. And then 2000, 2001, and part of 2002, we lived in Texas because my dad, after leaving AIM, we lived in our RV in the back of a machine shop in Kentucky for several months while they were preparing our RV. And then my dad traveled to Texas on a lead for a job, and he eventually found a church there.
Yeah. And so that's when, this is that time you're in
This
Texas.
is in that period. Then after that, he got a church in Iowa, and after that, he got a church in Mississippi.
Okay.
So your friend that you were doing the experimenting with, did he come from the same background that you did, or was it something separate?
So they were from a Christian background, yes.
Yeah.
And
so that was they were the ones that had the
conscience
about it. And
and
was
just
like, hey, we need
dude,
to stop.
yeah,
And
this needs to end.
And so that's just kind of interesting in general, because on the one hand, you have your upbringing where you're like, we just don't talk about sex. You skip over the word when you get to it in the Bible.
Yeah.
But in that moment, you knew there was probably something in what those passages were talking about sexual sin with what you were doing. But this other person was like, for sure, like, no, this is something we need to stop.
Eventually. I mean, they weren't immediately like, yeah, no, you're right. There were a couple more times. I don't remember exactly.
Right.
Again, I was 12 years old. That was forever ago. Theoretically.
And so between, you talked about, you remember like at 5 or 6 or whatever, having a kid being like, dude, are you gay? Or something like that. And then this is your, 6-7 years later or whatever, like that. Did that first statement from that kid when you were little, was that something that just kept coming up in your mind? Was it something you kept thinking about? Or did it never come up again until you started thinking about sexuality?
It never came up again. Honestly, I don't know that I remembered that statement before I started thinking about telling my story.
Yeah. It was when you were thinking about it that you remembered that.
Yeah. So
that childhood experience.
I didn't even make the connection back then of homosexuality because, again, we didn't talk about sexuality, so I didn't know what that was.
Yeah.
So I didn't even make that connection.
Yep.
Until a couple years later.
Yeah.
And that was, or a year later, I didn't make that connection until it was kind of too late.
Yeah. And so it started there. Did it immediately then follow into the addiction specifically to pornography like you were talking about?
It did not, just because I didn't have computer access at that time. And I don't think I really knew much about pornography at that time. There were I was addicted pretty much, if not right from that time, very shortly after that time, I discovered and became addicted to self-gratifying behaviors, we'll call them.
Yeah. Sure.
let the listeners figure out what that means on their own.
Yeah.
And I was addicted to those behaviors for, gosh, off and on until I got married.
Yeah.
I had a really good stretch right before I got married where I managed to do better. But then the pressures of, the anticipation of being married and the stress of planning a wedding and everything else, I didn't do so great.
Oh. So have you gotten better at managing your stress? Do you have methods of how you manage your stress now?
I did. I had friends, and I found out talking about stress with friends and venting helped a lot. And I learned that I'm really bad about burying things. So I've learned over the years to kind of not bury things. And if I can't feel like I can talk to the person that maybe this is causing the stress, I find somebody I can talk to.
Yeah, being able to have like a release valve to vent the things that you're feeling kept you from maybe going into some of the other more negative addictions.
I'd like to say, yes, I found the cure. Unfortunately, no, stress often comes out of me not so much in escapism now as it does in anger.
And it is interesting how I think that's definitely a big part of all the stories we've been talking about. You overcome one part of it, and there's always something else that that's you discover later along the way.
Yeah, we all pick a pet sin that is our worst, and we just kind of get it in our mind. If I could fix this one thing about myself, then I'd be a perfect person.
Right.
Because let's be honest, nobody really wants to think about everything that's wrong with them.
Right.
That would be really really depressing.
Yeah.
And so you deal with the one thing, and then it's there's another.
You get it out. You get over the one thing, and then all of a sudden you discover, well, crap.
So
I'm still not perfect.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's good to not look at, I guess, not define yourself from a Christian standpoint, not to define yourself by what you do, but your identity in God. Like, because I've had God literally tell me this before when I've done that same thing, pick myself apart about things I haven't done right. And he was like, and you're still a child of God. Like, it doesn't change anything. So,
yeah.
And so the different addictions and escapism started to kind of build up. But you did specifically mention in your story the addiction to pornography, which you said didn't come on later on. How did that come on, though?
Well, we
that.
moved to Iowa, and at that point, my mom was done homeschooling.
Yeah.
She was just done.
She'd had enough.
My younger brother had been kicked into a private school. My older brother and I were the only two who were homeschooled at that point because there were no private schools for our age.
Yeah.
So she was done. She put my younger brother James straight from the private school in Texas into the public school in Iowa. She put my younger sister, who turned school age at that point, into the public school in Iowa. And so we finished off our school year of homeschooling because we moved in the spring. I think we moved in the spring. So we finished off our school year, and then the next fall started public school in a very tiny school that the junior high school combined was like 150 kids. So you couldn't sneeze without everybody hearing you. So when one person,
was the whole school.
Yes.
Yeah.
So when one person decides, oh, this guy's gay, the whole school decides this person's gay. So for, about a year and a half, I thought my middle name was Fat. So actually my first name.
that was what you started having people refer to you as.
Yeah. It kind of became a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that in public school, 8th grade, terrible year to enter public school from homeschool background, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
I would definitely say if you're homeschoolers and you're thinking of putting your kids in public school, wait till high school.
Yeah.
Just wait till high school.
Yeah.
That was not what happened, though, and you went in 8th grade.
I went in 8th grade, and so obviously sexuality was everybody's favorite topic of conversation. So I just, heard people talk about porn. I, at church, was responsible. My dad started a split service. So he created a contemporary worship service. A lot of churches are doing
they do
now.
a traditional service with hymns and then a contemporary service with other style of music.
Yeah, so my dad actually started that idea at this church in Iowa. And so I wound up being the PowerPoint designer which meant I had access to the church secretary's computer so I could design the PowerPoint slides and everything. So unsupervised 13-year-old on a computer, shocker, where that went. And that was actually how I got caught.
Yeah, I was going to ask that question. I said,
It went on for several months before I got caught. I'm really not sure what she was typing in her search, in her Google, because this is before I learned how to delete search history.
Right.
I'm not sure what she went to search for on Google that brought up my search history, but I bet it was a shocker. I remember coming home from a dance with my brother and my, at the time, girlfriend. And, which people are going, wait, what? It was essentially just a friendship with a fancy title.
Yeah.
Because we were 13.
Right.
Well, I was 13. She was 12. Anyhow, I remember walking home, and my dad, strangely, came up to walk us home, and he kind of held us back, and he said, "You're caught." And my man's like, "What?" And he's like, "I think you know." I don't really remember how he explained it, but he told me, and I felt like I was going to be murdered. I wasn't. He was very loving and forgiving and tried to help me in his own way.
Right.
So, obviously, no computer access after that point, very shortly thereafter. And I was better from pornography, but I also learned, because my dad's big thing was I lied to him, because I would tell him I'm going to go do this, and I didn't.
Yeah.
I was going to do the other thing. And that was where I kind of learned lies of omission, because I felt really guilty about him saying I lied to him, and I never wanted him to be able to say that again. But in my brain, if you're not asking me how I'm doing and I'm not volunteering the information, it's not a lie. Which technically it isn't, but at the same time, if you know you're supposed to be telling them when you're struggling with certain things,
Yeah.
and you're not, okay, guys, come on.
It's not a lie, but it may be other things.
It's definitely deception.
And so, how old were you at that point in time?
I was still probably 13 or 14.
Yeah. So that's like your
Yeah.
8th grade is what you were saying.
Yeah, it was like right before. Well, this point I think was after the fact.
so was there any explanation of what sex was once they found out you were looking at those things?
So in the interim, my dad's answer to puberty was James Dobson's book, Preparing for Adolescence. And he basically just kind of handed it to us and said, here you go.
So when you read it, what exactly was it about, or what did it help with anything?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that
Yeah,
book.
I'm
What
not
was the
either.
basic premise?
It's basically focus on the family's attempt at preparing kids for puberty, what goes through your body. And yes, there is a section on sexuality and what sexuality entails and God's standards and so on. I just realized I got really far away from the mic. Oops. So yeah, I figured out what sexuality was supposed to be during that phase, but that was before I got to the computers. And originally, when I first started looking at porn, it was heterosexual porn. That lasted maybe through the first viewing, when my morbid curiosity just wanted to see if I could find gay porn. And the instant I saw my first naked man, my brain was hooked. Really embarrassing to admit that, but it's what it was.
Yeah. Do you remember it ever like being a thing you thought of before that moment? You know, like being attracted to other people of the same sex, or was that not?
I think
Even
so,
cross your
but
mind
not
for
in a
sexuality?
romantic sexual way. I don't think that was after that fact.
Yep.
After that fact,
Because I guess I'm
got
just
bad.
curious, what do you think? What was the curiosity in your head that you were just like, let me see if I can find?
I think. Well, okay, so there was I had not been attracted to other guys, but you got to remember I had that other experience. So
Yep.
I think something in my subconscious tied the two together.
Yep.
And made the connection.
Right. That makes sense. And so that started the addiction.
Yeah.
Kind of at that point. You guys were in Iowa for
Like a year and a half. It was the shortest stint.
It was the shortest stint. And then it was Mississippi after
Yes.
that. And so you were living in Mississippi when me and you
Yes.
met.
Technically, I met him first.
Oh,
But he
really?
was so
Yeah.
young that he wouldn't remember it.
I don't remember that.
Because my dad's church, all the churches did like a Christmas party thing. And I remember the very first year we were there, I think it might have been the only year we did it, that your parents were there and they brought you and the group from Sunbelt and did like a white elephant gift exchange. I don't remember all the details.
The you being Jacob for the people that aren't watching this right now.
Yeah.
Sorry, I watch it. I forget.
remember the churches doing that.
Yeah.
So.
And so Jacob was little kid.
Yeah,
Little
Jacob was a
tiny
little
kid.
kid, and that following summer, his dad was the dean of my very first year at the church camp in Newton.
Right. And so this church camp in Newton is the camp where me and Jordan met.
Back when Nick had hair.
Back when I had hair.
He had a curly mop on top of his head.
I did have hair, and I was several pounds thinner back then.
Me too.
And I remember meeting you there because I was it was a whole culture shock experience for me because I was this kid from the city, from Memphis. I came down with my youth band that I was a part of for our church when we were going to play worship for this week of church camp, and showed up in Newton, Mississippi with a lot of very, very, very Southern people with very thick accents, and it was a whole bunch of culture shock. And so, if I have to be honest, Jordan, I feel like I met so many characters. I don't specifically remember the very first time me and you met. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Okay.
Because you and Kyle were actually running sound at the beginning.
Yes.
It wasn't until the next year that you actually started playing.
Yeah.
Or somewhere
That makes sense.
Over the year
Yep.
that lapsed. And you guys were the worship band. So you guys were cool, and I may or may not have had a crush on the lead singer. But
so you were like, cool worship band. I want to talk to those
cool worship
guys.
band, and I'm a musically kind of inclined person.
Yep.
And so I remember you and Kyle kind of seemed like the only approachable people.
Yeah, my friend Kyle and I were the nerds that were running sound in the back, so we weren't as cool as the guys on stage.
Though in hindsight, I think people might laugh about hearing Kyle referred to as approachable.
And so we were the two sound guys back there, and so you come up and talk to us. Is that what you're saying?
I think
Okay.
I kind of just wound up hanging around you guys as much as I humanly could.
Yeah, because I remember you being around. Like I said, I just don't
Yeah.
remember the very first time we met.
Yeah, I was insecure and clingy like that. So
And the part I do remember, and we were talking about this a little bit as we were getting ready for this deep dive, is I believe it was that first year of camp that I was down there as well. Towards the end of the week of camp, they do a big bonfire.
I know where you're going.
And I don't remember if the sermon focused specifically on like confessing things.
It was Newton. Every sermon was about confessing things and giving it all to Jesus.
Yeah. and so that's what kids were doing. They were like talking about confessing things that were going on in their life. That was an interesting summer for me too, because that was the summer I was feeling a calling to go into ministry myself. And so I vaguely remember that same campfire being kind of one of those times when I was like feeling like I think God's telling me I need to look at ministry for what I'm going to be doing. Mm-hmm. But the way I remember it is it was towards the end of the campfire. Like we'd already been there for like 2 hours or something like that.
I kind of had to build up my nerve.
And Jordan comes forward and confesses to the whole group there that he had been struggling with looking at gay pornography and all kinds of things like that was going on in his life, which was kind of a bombshell for all the
It is a lot of courage
Christian
to do it,
kids.
though.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think made you feel like that was the moment you needed to? Because if I remember correctly, you said this was the first time you had ever your dad had
Publicly
confronted
announced,
you
yeah.
and some of that, but this is the first time you had publicly announced it.
Well, I am a huge, to use biblical terms, I am a attention harlot. So I think there was that looking for attention. I do think I was genuinely feeling convicted because it was an off and on thing. Mm-hmm. It was kind of the cycle of shame that perpetuates every addiction. So I think I was feeling guilty about it. I do honestly think there was a bit of an attention ploy there, which you talk about, oh, that takes courage. Well, if you're insecure and an attention harlot, there you can get to a place where you have the mantra, there is no such thing as bad attention. So even bad attention is good attention kind of philosophy. So I think there's the part of me that thought, even if I'm rejected,
it's
I
at least some
definitely
attention.
at the time think I was feeling like God wanted me to say that.
Mm-hmm.
So when you confessed that, what was the response of the people who heard it?
They were actually really loving and accepting.
Mm-hmm.
I remember one of the counselors, youth minister by the name of Ben Thomas. You remember him, Nick?
Yeah.
Came up to me after. I was like, dude, that took some serious cojones to like admit that.
Yeah. And I remember talking with the other kids from the band when we were driving on our way back, and them feeling the same way. You know, like Jordan was the topic of conversation in the worship band.
I might have to take my hat off. My head's going to get too big on that one. He never actually told me that.
Yeah, because I remember we were leaving in the van right as your dad came to pick you up, and your dad came to pick you up, and he got you. And I don't remember who it was, but one of the youth camp leaders like pulling your dad aside, and we were all just like, "Oh, I know what conversation is going on there." And I just remember some of the other guys from the band being like, not knowing what your family life was like, and wondering just like, I hope his dad isn't like a jerk about this. Like, I hope he's actually kind of helpful to him.
No,
and we had no
on the
idea.
flip side, my dad loves telling my story without my permission.
Oh, not without the permission. That's not good.
Every preacher parent loves that.
Yeah, I feel like when it comes to things like sexual history, though, they should ask.
They should.
For sure.
You know.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, I just remember we were just like, I wonder how his parents are going to take this and what's going to kind of happen from there. Do you remember in the next months, years after that, you know, there was this couple years before you ended up in Bible college and everything like that. What were the next few years like after this kind of public moment of talking about it being something you were struggling with?
Kind of the same, honestly.
Yeah.
It was church camp, so anyone who's done a lot of church camp visiting knows that you go to church camp, you feel convicted, you get spiritually hyped up, and then a week later you're right back to your daily life when it's gone, and then you look forward to going back to church camp so you can get right with God.
Yeah.
And repeat the cycle.
Repeat
over
the
and
cycle.
over and over again.
So
Not
what
really a healthy cycle. I'm not trying to down church camps, but
So I've never been to church camp. So what do you think is the issue there where it's like it gets you hyped up to do the right thing and then you immediately fall off? It's like, is there some disconnect between the time you spend there between the time you leave?
I think there's more of a peer pressure at the time.
It's a lot of peer pressure, but also a lot of a lot of people will describe it. You're on like this mountaintop moment where you feel really close to God, and you've been listening to the music all day, every day. You're listening to multiple sermons. You're with a bunch of Christians, so the like emotion is really high, and then you're away from all the stress of your daily life, and then you go home, and you don't have that same mountaintop security, closeness with God. And you just fall back into your same routine.
Also, especially with addictions, a change of scenery makes a big difference. So it's really easy to abstain when you're in a new environment. But when you have a week or so, usually by my experience, a week is about all it takes to kind of get into a routine, then your brain starts going, hey, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you kind of went back to more of the same, just kind of the cycle of shame and the in and out with the addiction and the issues that you were dealing with.
I mean, at that point, I feel like it was less out and more in, but yeah.
Yeah. And so then I kept going back to that same summer camp the next few summers after that, and I would see Jordan every summer, and eventually you decided to come and study at Mid-South Christian College.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember? Did you have any idea what you wanted to be doing? Like, what was your future goals with that, or did you just feel like Bible college?
I remember. Well, so the college had a recruiter, Josh Russell, who came to camp every year.
Mm-hmm.
And he always talked about the statistics of if you go to Bible college, your likelihood of, even if you just do 1 year Bible college, your likelihood of not walking away from church and from the faith is like exponentially greater than the statistics of Christians who go straight into a secular college.
Right.
Yeah.
I actually wasn't originally thinking Mid-South Christian College.
Yeah.
I wanted to study vocal music at Ozark Christian College.
Yeah.
But the midwinter before I graduated high school, they had, I think it was the very first year ever of doing like a midwinter retreat for like juniors and seniors. And a different recruiter from Mid-South, David Vayon, came onto the scene and was talking about this new program they were going to start where you were actually going to be involved in ministry from the get-go.
Right.
A program that actually didn't get off the ground until 2 years later, but we won't go there.
They were talking about it already, and
yes,
that got you attracted.
And it was David Vayon, and he's one heck of a salesman. I'm pretty sure he could sell ice to an Eskimo. So,
and so you were interested in that,
and so I felt
at least
felt
do
like,
1 year.
Well, I felt like God was telling me this is where I'm supposed to go.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've had a lot of instances in my life where I thought God was telling me things, and I think this is the only one where I could go, yeah, that was probably him.
And so you ended up here at the school.
Mm-hmm.
I was in my senior year of high school, I remember.
Mm-hmm.
So I came to the school the next year after that. And is that right?
No, because you came in 2010.
Right.
I came in 2008.
Okay. So it was
yeah.
2 years before
Mm-hmm.
I came. And I remember we were, the way the dorms are set up here at the school, you know, there's like a shared living room area, and then everybody has kind of their separate rooms that they may or may not have a roommate in off of that, but then shared living and kitchen space between everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember I moved into the dorms, and we were immediately in one of the same dorm units. And I remembered from church camp, you know, your fireside confession and some of the things that you had talked about struggling with. But I wasn't sure if that was something to talk about with, you know, if that was something you had talked about with any of the other students at the school, and just always trying to navigate that, like you said. Like, I didn't want to be your dad who was just telling your story to everybody else and all that kind of stuff. But from what we've talked about since then, you've told me that even in your Bible college years, not only did you continue in some of the bad habits, but things started to get worse. So what happened there?
My virginity, such as it was, didn't make it past my first semester here.
Yeah.
Because I was unsupervised. I had internet for the first time in my life, and I had a whole lot of stress. Didn't find out until after I was almost graduated, when Jane Gibson pointed it out to me. I'm ADHD. I did not know that, as the shirt shows. I didn't know that because I always did great in school. I was valedictorian of my high school because school was easy for me.
So
nobody would have assumed it, but that's because I think school in high school is you do this really short thing. Well, you do this thing and then you're done.
Yeah.
So in my brain, get the busy work done, and then I can read my books, work on my writing, work on my drawing, whatever. And I had that incentive of do this really short thing in this structured environment, and then I'm done.
Yeah.
College was not like that. You had to create your own time, your own structure, and ADHDers in particular, beyond just having attention issues, a lot of us struggle with starting a task that's going to be difficult or finishing it. So we're procrastinators. So I was really good at
So college
putting
was a
thing-
whole different thing.
College was very stressful because I would put things off to the last minute and then have all of this stuff. And very early on in the process, I discovered a website where guys would come online because I was also 18, so now I could access these types of things. And you could go online and meet guys who wanted to have sexual hookups. So I'm not sure how long I had discovered that site before I actually had my first hookup, but I remember it was almost the end of my first semester here when I had someone pick me up at a nearby store so that they weren't on campus, and I arranged for a hookup. And yeah. Then felt immediately guilty, but it kind of created this cycle where I think the farthest I ever went was a year between encounters.
And like you said, you would like meet off campus and all kinds of different things like that. So did you get caught doing that, or what was it that happened with that? I don't even remember. Like,
You probably
how
don't
that
know
went through.
this story.
I don't think I do.
So on this site, you put compromising pictures. Except I was young, dumb, had a Nokia brick phone.
Yeah.
No way of taking pictures. There was a digital camera in the dorms. It was the colleges. And so I was using that to try and take pictures to upload to this site, but it had a dead battery. And I had no way of charging it. So the student, Michael Henry, who had the camera, I had to confess to him what I had done and asked him to charge it and delete the pictures. Well, he didn't have the charger. So David Vahan, I think, was the one who got the camera and discovered those pictures. So then I had to have a very awkward sit down with your dad and the dean of students, Brent Lynn.
Yep. And what do you remember your emotions being like in that point in time? Like, was it similar to when your dad confronted you?
Yeah, I thought I was dead.
Yeah.
In high stress situations like that, my brain shuts down and I freeze, and I was panicked to the max.
Do you remember being surprised at the reaction from people, or what was your feeling?
Not necessarily, because up to that point, nobody had really given me the fire and brimstone reaction. I mean, my dad, when my older brother tried to kind of speak up in my defense of, well, I mean, porn is just kind of something all guys get into at one point, my dad kind of looked at him and said, this is not natural.
And so he pushed back on that, but
But
nobody had really given
But
you
other
like
than that,
a
no one has been like,
angry-
you are the worst of the worst and you're going to burn in hell.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I was really expecting that.
Right. And so you kind of got more of the same
Yeah.
reaction that people gave
Yeah.
you. I remember over the next few years of school, there was different situations that some ended up better than others.
Yeah. I actually got suspended
Yeah.
for an entire semester.
Was that the incident you got suspended about, or something?
No, that was 2 years later.
Oh, okay.
Over the summer, no less.
Oh, really?
I was supposed to go to a CIY conference for the college and be a rep for the college. And the night before, I fell off the bandwagon again. So at like midnight, I'm waking up our dean of students, Brent Lynn, and having to tell him what happened and what I had done. And he, of course, said, don't go on the trip.
Yep.
And a couple days later got a hold of me and told me I was going to be suspended for the upcoming fall semester.
So was this like the same kind of incident with the cameras, or was it just something completely different?
This was different because at this point, I think this was the third or fourth time something had happened.
Oh, okay.
So I think at this point, the college kind of is like, okay, we kind of got to say something.
Yeah.
And I
got a
know,
lot better at hiding it after that.
and I know that is one of the things, as we've talked about your story over the years, that was, in hindsight, difficult about how you were at a Christian college around people that were supposed to be helping you through a lot of these issues. And you kind of mentioned it in your short version of it, but it wasn't really until you moved to Missouri that you felt like you really got the accountability
that I needed.
That you felt like you needed.
I certainly didn't want it.
Yeah. Like you said, you had gotten really good at
Yeah.
hiding it. And it is interesting how, like, Christians ourselves supposed to be helping each other through some of these kind of things didn't feel like we wanted to have
I don't think anyone knew.
whatever.
I don't think anyone really knew how to deal with it because it's
Right.
not something you can really relate to if it's not something you've dealt with, or at least you thought. Because that was one of the lies I told myself.
Right.
And that I think the devil used to help keep me enchained was that this was worse and different than any other sexual sin out there.
And no one knew how to. They wouldn't have any way of relating to you anyway.
I felt, like I was scum of the earth for still struggling with these things, even though I claimed to love Jesus. But I used that shame to kind of perpetuate the cycle, and it could also become, kind of I used it as an excuse, I think. Well, nobody understands and nobody gets just how hard this is for me, because addicts are really good about victimizing themselves in every situation so that they have an excuse to act out.
And so you were just like, nobody understands me.
Yeah.
Nobody knows what this is like. This is really hard for me. And all of those things were just kind of perpetuating this cycle. The people in your Christian bubble at this Christian college were not sure how to deal with it,
And at that point, I had started pulling back some because I realized, oh crap, if I get caught messing up again, I'm out.
Right.
So it became less of a I had less motivation to be fully forthcoming.
Right. And so I hate to skip over this part of the story because this is a big part too, but we're running short on time. You came to work with me on the coffee shop project we've mentioned several times, Avenue Coffee. You were one of the original founding team members of Avenue Coffee, helped get that off the ground. And me and
I was the ugly redheaded stepchild.
And we were roommates during that period of time. Was it just a year? Was it about a year and a half?
Yeah, I think it was about a year. Well, I mean, we were roommates at your parents' house.
Yeah.
From the spring, but then I think we were in the house only a year.
And both kind of started coming to the decision that we were going to go different ways.
Yeah.
I was eventually going to go back to school, and you ended up moving to Missouri to live with some friends of yours that you had a connection with before. So how did that move happen, and who were those friends?
So over the summer, my second summer here, I went and did an internship out in Indiana. Had no at the camp, actually, that I had grown up at. Had no friends, no connections, but I had recently joined an online forum for fantasy writers, Christian fantasy writers. And I became really connected in that forum, actually wound up becoming a leader. One of the other key members was my friend who we will call Nikki, because I don't have permission to share her story.
Yeah.
So my friend Nikki and I connected online, and I even wound up going to her wedding. There was about a year between, though, when you and I split up being roommates, and then I moved.
Right.
So during that year, I actually wound up going to her wedding with another one of our friends from the internet forum. And I was living in Olive Branch at the time. The preacher at Olive Branch Christian Church had let me stay with him for a while, and I was nearing the end of that tenure, and I had no options, no ideas of what I was going to do with my life. And I just kind of mentioned that to my friend Nikki, and she said, well, my old roommate moved out and got a house when I got married, but because of her job, she doesn't really stay there because I have to keep her kids because of her job. I watch her kids. And she's not really living in the house, honestly. So if you want to move in and help her with rent, you can move up here and we'll kind of help you get back on your feet.
Yeah.
So I was like, sweet. moved up there. It was not what I anticipated. Nikki's marriage was falling apart just a year, not even a year in, because the husband was abusive, but I did not find that out till much later. But it was falling apart. There was lots of tension and turmoil, and
and it was a straight into the frying pan kind of situation when you moved there.
Yeah, like there were maybe 2 weeks, and then by the third week, we were just hanging out in their living room. Next thing I know, she is like this normally nice, happy person is like ugly yelling at him with all the hatred you could ever imagine coming out of one human being, and then some. And I just remember feeling uber uncomfortable.
So I know that you talked a lot about, stress being the source of the addiction, so that exacerbate the addiction you had with the environment you were in?
I don't think it helped. I also wound up eventually getting an overnight job. And that really meant I was always tired. And so I was always tired. There was stress. And I think all of that did not go well together.
And so even though with this, the craziness of that situation, how terrible everything was going, you've told me that there were some real benefits that you feel like happened during that time. In the short version of your story, you talked about a friend who challenged you to read about the love of God.
Yeah.
Was it that one of these friends, or
it was actually the fill-in preacher at our church.
At this church in Missouri?
At the church in Missouri.
Yeah.
Which was actually an old friend of Nikki's roommate, Susie.
Okay.
And they invited him and his wife to come help out in the fill-in pastor position, specifically because they thought he would be able to help figure out what was going on with Nikki's marriage.
Yeah.
So I kind of formed a little bit of a friendship there.
Did he know any of the issues you were struggling with?
Not initially, but he kind of found out.
Yeah. And so was it after he found out that he encouraged you to do this study?
No, that was after I had two hookups in one day after work.
Yeah. And so...
kind of an all-time low for me.
Yeah. And so he encouraged you to do that study. What did that look like? What did you end up going to do?
Well, I, being the know-it-all Bible college student that I was, because I was the really insufferable Bible college student who thought he knew everything. I don't know how anyone put up with me. Anyhow, I was like, well, I immediately thought of 1 John and thought of the verse in 1 John chapter 3 that says, behold, what manner of love the Father has given unto us. So I was like, well, shoot, I'll just do a study of the love of God in 1 John. Yeah, that was really dumb. I wasn't even one chapter in where there was a verse in chapter 1 that says if anyone claims to be in the light but is walking in darkness, he's lying, to paraphrase.
Yep.
Another verse just like it in chapter 2. You get to the verse I was looking for in chapter 3. Immediately following, there are 3 verses that talk about if you're living in sin but claiming to follow God, yeah, that's cute.
Yeah.
And
so,
I tried to weasel out of that for about 2 weeks, and having accountability conversations and counseling conversations over those about 2-3 weeks span. And then I had one night, I remember, where it just kind of got me all at once. And I was supposed to be going into work, and I sat in my car feeling, and it was a Reformed church, which was new for me. So that had me in this whole mindset of, well, if these verses are saying that this means I'm not saved, does that mean, and I've done all of these different Christian things in my past to try and get saved, does that mean I'm not ever going, am I just predestined for hell?
Right. Because Reformed churches also, a lot of people use the term Calvinist, churches that talk about God predestines people for heaven or hell. And you were reading these verses and thinking, maybe I'm just one of the people who's not predestined for heaven.
So it was spiraling around in my head. I was feeling very anxious, and I remember just saying, God, look, I don't know what's going on. I don't know if I am. I don't know. I just know I can't get through this night at work with all of this freaking me out. I need you to help me, even if I don't deserve it. And I remember there being a peace there. So the following day, I'm talking to my preacher, and I'm telling him kind of the struggle I've been having. Am I not? He's like, well, I don't know, but I know you can go to the Savior. I'm like, but if I've done all of these things, how can I know? He's like, well, because he says if you go to him, he'll answer. And so I think you should just go home and pray through some of the promises of God, knowing that God won't lie. And immediately, as he said it, before I even got in my car, a verse I had taught through a summer program back in Mississippi when I was like 15. A verse we taught to kids, a memory verse, Jeremiah 33:3, came instantly to mind, where God says, call to me and I will answer you, and I will show you great and unsearchable things which you do not know. And I remembered that verse, and I remembered that tie-in of God can't lie. And that was kind of a light bulb moment for me, that realization that it isn't about me, because up to that point, I had created this ritual of sin and then trying some way to make it up with God. Part of your story from a couple weeks back that really resonated with me was that idea that you say anytime you mess up, you'd be like, God, give me back my salvation, and you'd be panicked. I was kind of different, but I was in a similar place. I kind of created this ritual of, okay, mess up, then you do your Hail Marys, and then, or say, God, I'm sorry, get your slap on your wrist, and then you go right back to business as usual. Right. So I wasn't as good about it as you were. I wasn't scared. I was playing the system in my brain. So this realization that it isn't about the Hail Marys. It isn't about anything I can do. The only reason God saves anyone is because he's just that good. It's about throwing yourself on his goodness. That I will leave up for debate, whether that was the moment of my salvation or not, but it was definitely the moment that changed me.
All right. Well, Nick had to step out. He has a meeting that he needs to get to, but we didn't want to end the conversation, so we're going to continue on where we left off before that cut there. So if you want to continue with now that you are at a place where you're getting better, you've kind of felt that peace from God.
Yeah.
And
I still didn't trust it right at first because, again, I'd had mountaintop experiences before that lasted days, sometimes months in a good scenario. So I wasn't really, and I didn't call it a conversion. I just said, I don't know what happened. I just know it was different. But it definitely, I immediately noticed the change. I started feeling a lot more at peace with God. I actually felt a sudden passion for actually learning more about this God who saved me. Even though I'd been to Bible college and theoretically should know him, I kind of realized just how little I knew God. So I had this earnestness to learn more about God and his goodness and kind of get to know this God who saved me when he absolutely had no reason to, because I was a mess and didn't deserve it. That paired up with my accountability started getting, because up to that point, they were still kind of letting me, giving me enough rope to hang myself. And then at that point, when things got really bad and things turned around, they started to say, all right, if you want to get better, you're actually going to have some hard conversations. And it's from that I started learning some of the things about myself, like I run like heck as soon as things get difficult, and I tend to escape. It was a couple years in that I learned that my addiction wasn't just to pornography. I have a screen addiction. They took my computer away. That was actually one of the biggest things. They took my computer away to check it and make sure there was nothing harmful on it, but then they never gave it back.
Okay.
I went through withdrawal. I was not a nice person for like 2 weeks. Because, I was heavily screen addicted. It wasn't just pornography. It's just I would escape into the screen.
Being on the computer.
I lived my life on the computer practically. I mean, I would just go over to Nikki and Susie's house and basically tune out so that I could be on the Wi-Fi and totally ignore them and their kids and everything. I was a mess. So having my computer taken away was actually one of the best things that ever happened to me in that regards. Obviously, salvation was the biggest, but but as far as for help, having to just it was taken away and I couldn't get it back. Because at one point I'd had an accountability partner who I'd give my computer to, but as soon as I asked for it back, they gave it back. That doesn't really work.
Yeah.
Doesn't help.
See, that's not how it should work. You should be like, okay, are you sure? Yeah, that's not how that happened. So they took it away.
Did they like still let you have a phone or like?
I had a flip phone.
Okay. So
Because
you
I
didn't have a
always
smartphone.
kept myself to cheap flip phone technology because I told myself I couldn't handle smartphone. And I had a filter on my computer, so that's why I could have my computer, even though I found so many ways past that thing. A lot of the sites I wound up going to had the HTTPS, and at that particular time, my filter wasn't able to block them, which made it worthless. So I did at one point buy a smartphone that I just used on Wi-Fi, and I think the justification for that was so that I could use I could sync my Spotify playlists to it and have music wherever I went. Yeah, they took that away because that was what I used to get myself into trouble and to arrange the hookups. So they took that away. They took the computer away. I only had my flip phone. And, that's kind of the verse Jesus talks about if your eye offends you, gouge it out. If your hand offends you, cut it off. Well, I had somebody who loved me enough to amputate the hand for me.
Yeah.
Resented it for a couple weeks. It was bad. I was not a nice person right up front. The next step was realizing that TV was part of it. So I still had a DVD player at home, and I owned the entire series of Touched by an Angel on DVD. Don't judge. And I got to a place where my brain started trying to substitute that. And so I would come home, and when I'm supposed to be sleeping because I worked an overnight shift, instead I'd just stay up watching Touched by an Angel, telling myself I was just going to play it in the background and fall asleep, except I'm a screen junkie, so I didn't actually fall asleep. So I wound up giving that to them myself, and I kind of then found out, books are just as bad. I mean, books aren't bad, but I could use books in the same kind of escapist way, so I wound up having to be really Nazi with myself for a while, and I was almost never home alone. So I basically lived at Nikki and Susie's house. I got a roommate eventually. Nikki's brother wound up becoming my roommate. And so sometimes he and I would hang out and do things. I switched jobs and stopped working overnight at Steak and Shake because it just really wasn't a good environment for me. It was very stressful. It was 30 minutes away, and I would come home and from the 30-minute drive and be like about ready to pull onto the street I need to get to go home, to enter into my town to go home, and realize I don't remember any of this drive because I was dead tired and half asleep. So I got a different job, and that really helped, getting a better job, better sleep cycle and everything. But I was hanging out with them all the time, and I kind of just used them to fill the emptiness in my life. It was kind of in that phase of living with them, living basically at their house, that things started to shift. There's a lot of drama that happened over the next year of 2017. Church split, ugliness. Our preacher and wife walked out of a church meeting, tried to get Nikki and Susie kicked out of the church. And so we wound up really coming together at that point, because we were all each other had. But rewind a little bit. So I got a new job because one of the ladies at church got me a job working at basically a museum. The St. Genevieve has a lot of historic homes. It's got the most vertical log homes, which is a French thing, on their original location in the country. And we owned one of them and several other historic properties, and I was the housekeeper for these historic houses. Well, the same lady had already gotten a young lady she knew, friend of her family's, a job there. And so over the summer, I'm working there. Now, granted, I'm just thinking I need to get closer to God. I'm not envisioning ever meeting anyone. And if I did in my brain, I thought it was going to have to be somebody with a dirty past like mine, who, knew what it meant to be sexually broken and wasn't going to judge me for that. So, but I wasn't hoping for it, wasn't really looking for it. So I was working one day that summer, and this girl started working during the week. She was originally a weekender. She started working in the week. I remember one day I'm trying to carry like 50 different cleaning things because I don't want to have to make 2 trips across the street to the house I'm cleaning. Mm-hmm. And the mop bucket I'm carrying dumps completely on the floor, water everywhere. And I guess I had a funny look on my face because she burst out laughing. Mm-hmm. And I remember thinking, you might want to get like a bucket to puke in after this comment. I remember thinking, wow, I could spend the rest of my life making her laugh like that. I know. This is what happens when you let your teenage son watch too much Hallmark Channel. Hallmark movies are bad for the brain. Anyhow.
But your wife is watching. She's going to be like, that's points for you. That's good.
She's heard me tell this story before. So I started thinking, maybe. But I'm also a coward, so I didn't rush it, and I just kind of went, maybe, but I don't know. So then the church split happened. In my brain, I'm thinking, well, crap. This girl is friends with one of the people involved, and they think we're Mud. Our name is Mud. So there went any hope with her. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, they weren't really close to her anymore at that point either, and she started becoming friends with our friend group. And because of where her parents lived, she often would wind up spending the night with Nikki and Susie on weekends that she worked. And she was actually grew up with Susie for a couple of years when they were younger. So Susie was like, I'm getting my friend back. Caitlin has Jordan. That's her friend. And I'm going to get my friend. Mm-hmm. And she was really surprised because suddenly I was around even more. Mm-hmm. So we started hanging out a lot. But it wasn't until several months later where Nikki and Susie kind of sat me down and was like, okay, you two ignore our very existence in our own home. You need to realize what's going on here and put a name on it and realize stop saying, oh, well, maybe, but she doesn't know that I feel this. Y'all need to just take care of business already. So I wound up calling her dad, terrified me, let me tell you, and asking permission to court his daughter.
That's so old fashioned. I've never heard. I mean, my mom told me that my dad asked her dad to marry her, but as far as just even just to date someone, I've never heard somebody do that.
Oh, it was kind of an old-fashioned group.
Yeah.
So, yeah, her parents are a little old-fashioned that way. So, yeah, I mean, he was real. His daughter, in fairness, was 29 at that point, and she was convinced because she had skin issues. So she was convinced no guy would ever want her. So she was convinced she was never going to get married, and she was quite happy to live in her parents' basement as a 29-year-old, not spinster because she doesn't spin, but she's a 29-year-old knitster.
And how old were you at the time?
I was 28.
Okay.
Because I'm actually a year younger than her. So, so they were like, we thought she was never going to meet a guy, and she thought, so they were like, sweet. Her dad had health issues, so they were not going to support a long courtship. So we wound up so I talked to him maybe in May, and we wound up getting married in November.
Earlier on in the story that you kind of, because of that stress of planning the wedding and the engagement and stuff, that you kind of, I guess, fell off the bandwagon. What happened with
So
that?
I fell back into self-gratifying tendencies quite a bit over the few months of our engagement. Mm-hmm. I would get better for a little bit, but then still not. But I remember Susie sitting me down and talking about, you can't carry that into your marriage because if once you open that door, you'll never close it. Mm-hmm. And it will bring everything that it always brings into your marriage, and you won't get back from that. Mm-hmm. And somehow, by the grace of God, certainly not because I'm super Christian, but somehow by the grace of God, with that truth, my brain just locked in on that. And after I got married, I have not actually fallen into self-gratifying behaviors since then.
Okay.
I don't know how. It's not because I have such great strength of will, but somehow when she said, you can't bring that in, don't even open that door, my brain said, all right, I won't. And God has helped me to not, which has been amazing because we're talking, I could maybe go a year without hooking up, but my longest stretch of not self-gratifying was maybe a month or two. So
I'm curious, how much did your wife know about your struggles before y'all got married?
I had to tell her everything. My accountability told me that it was not an option to keep it a secret, and I don't think it should have been.
Yeah.
So
About how long out from the wedding did you?
it was pretty early on in the courtship, and
Okay.
I was a mess and was afraid she wasn't going to want me, wasn't going to love me, because, again, my wife was pure.
Yeah.
Because she thought she was never going to have any man. So I certainly didn't feel like I deserved her. And I was very nervous about having the conversation. She's just like, okay. And I was just kind of underwhelmed, like, what? Well, I mean, I love you, you love me, and it's in your past. So,
Yeah.
and I was like, blink, 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 blink. Okay.
That wasn't the reaction I was expecting.
No, it really wasn't.
Like,
Yeah. And so I'm assuming in the last several years, and since you've told her that, and since you've gotten married, she's been a part of keeping you clean.
Yes, more so this past year, but that's a different part of the story that
Yeah.
I'm not sure we have time for. But but yes, she's been a part of my accountability, especially recently, because she's been my only accountability.
Yeah.
So like I recently got a smartphone because I've been sticking to flip phones my entire life, but I had a flip phone that I have to text a lot for work, and I had a flip phone where the key's stuck, and where you couldn't, in predictive auto-correcting text, capitalize unless it was after a period. So you'd have to switch into the old school where you go A, B, C, D to get capital letters. So that and the buttons would stick, and I just could not effectively text. So I got a smartphone. So my wife found a parental monitoring app that she could put on my phone. Paid a pretty penny for it, but it's worth it. She can see everything I do on my phone now. She controls when I can access the internet, when I cannot. She controls what apps I can get access to, what apps I cannot. So yeah, she's really been a big help there with that, because I had
Very
always said I was
supportive,
never going to have smart technology because I just knew I could abuse it.
so do you think you're ever going to get to the point where you don't need that, where you don't need someone to kind of monitor what you're looking at, where you can just be like, okay, I'm good, I got this?
I don't foresee that.
Really? Why not?
I know myself, and I still, even in the 4 hours a day sometimes that I have of internet access, I still can wind up looking up and going, that was just 4 hours of my day off, and I've totally ignored my wife and my kids. There have been days here lately where I don't even ask her to switch the internet on for me, because I know that if she does, I'm going to be right into it. So maybe. I also never thought I was going to be married with twins. So obviously my judgment on where I'm going to end up in life is
There's foresight
It's
that you
questionable.
have, and then there's God's plan.
Yeah.
Because I think
So-
it's possible. I think with God, anything is possible. So I think it's possible you could get to that point where it's like, okay, I can monitor it myself, and I can look at it for a short period of time and then pay attention to my family as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
I think that will probably be years in the making, though, because I also think one of the biggest things I've learned is that any addiction, really, I think you can't fight it on your own, and you
True.
need a support group.
Yeah.
And right now it's just me and my wife, so I definitely know when I have no external accountability is not a time to try that.
Yeah. Saying it out loud to other people gives you and other people the power to do something.
Yeah.
If it's never spoken, there's never power given. And so it just holds on to you
Yeah.
and your soul. And it's just there.
Yeah, isolation is definitely the bread and butter of addiction. It feeds on isolation, and
Yeah.
thus it tries to create as much isolation as it can. I mean, even years later, I'm doing better thanks to God and my wife and and the relationship I have with her and our children.
And,
Yeah, but that really was what turned it around for me, was the fact that I was very obviously at that point shaming his name by claiming to be a good Christian and then sneaking around and doing the dirty things I was doing. And in that place, he got my attention and said, hey,
Yeah.
this isn't right. And hey, I love you even though it's not right. And that was what really
Yeah.
changed me, was just that realization. Because again, I grew up a church kid who had all the recipes of all the different churchy things you do to get good with God. And just that realization, I'd done all of them. None of them worked because I was still not actually following him. And he still somehow chose to love me in spite of that. And that is really what it's all about, is his love. And that was just mind-blowing.
And I think that's a really good point to end on today, honestly. So I know you're planning on being around a little more, as hopefully as
Say a prayer. I had a job interview today. Say a prayer.
So, leave a comment on this video, reach out to the church so we can let Jordan know. Or if you see Jordan at church one time, encourage him, tell him that, how much his story is meant to you. If it's spoken to you, if it's helped you realize how much God can love you, let him know. And then, just show some Christian love to the people you meet, because you never know what kind of struggles they're going through.
But if you find out they're like mine, be a good Christian. Take their computers.
Exactly.
Take their computers. Take their phone.
Do the Christian love thing, even if it's the hard love
And if you're
thing.
the one who's struggling, let them take the computer. Let them take the phone. It's going to suck, but it's worth it.
Thank you so much for tuning in. This was a longer podcast,
Sorry.
but it was a really good story, a really good message. And I hope you know God loves you, we love you, and have a good week.